My name is Alma Zalecki. I'm Director of Academic Affairs here at the New School. I'm also the coordinator of the New School's Food Studies curriculum. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all tonight to our panel discussion on Craig Claiborne and the invention of food journalism. Before I introduce tonight's moderator, who will in turn introduce the members of our panel, I want to tell you a little bit about the Food Studies program at the New School. As some of you may know, the New School has been offering a few courses in culinary history for many years. But beginning in spring 2008, we began offering a full complement of courses, workshops, and events like this one on food history, culture, politics, policy, and business. Our aim with this new curriculum was to join the burgeoning conversation on food production, distribution, quality, and taste that's really been bubbling up in the last few years and is still going strong, as evidenced by our terrific turnout for tonight's event. In addition to our courses, we offer special events like this one every semester. And tonight's event is our fourth Culinary Luminary series program, following on Julia Child, Culinary Revolutionary, in the summer of 2008, MFK Fisher, Poet of the Appetites, in fall 2008, and James Beard, the quintessential American epicure, in spring 2009. If you missed them, these events were webcast and are available on 4TV at the address that's on your handout for tonight's event. And I should mention that tonight's event is also being webcast, so this is your reminder to turn your cell phones off or turn them on their quiet mode. Thank you very much. I see lots of people moving down to do that. And to remember to speak up when you ask your question at the end of our panel presentation. We're finalizing our plans for next fall's Culinary Luminary panel discussion, and I encourage you to sign up for our newsletter and watch our website and our catalog for details as they're finalized. And now onto our discussion. The moderator of tonight's panel is culinary historian, food writer, and member of the New School's Food Studies faculty, Andrew Smith, sitting behind me. Andy is a prolific writer and frequent contributor to academic journals and popular magazines. He's the author of 16 books, with I think 2 more coming this year, including, so far, Peanuts, The Illustrious History of the Goober Pea, The Tomato in America, The Turkey, A Social History, and most recently, Hamburger, A Global History. Hamburger is one of the first books in the delightful edible series published by Reaction Books, for which Andy is the series editor. Each book traces the history of a global food in about 150 pages, and if you haven't seen them, I encourage you to take a look. They're really delicious little bites of culinary history, and one of Andy's forthcoming books is on the history of the potato. Andy's also the author of the Encyclopedia of Junk Food and Fast Food, and the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Companion to American Food and Drink. He has taught culinary history courses at the New School for 13 years, and somehow finds the time to moderate each of our Culinary Luminary panel discussions so far, in addition to getting all those books out on time. Now, please join me in welcoming Andy and our panelists.
Thank you very much, Almaz. We made the decision to focus this session on Craig Claiborne in the fall of last year. And when we made that decision, I decided I wanted to make sure we cast our net wide to get the best people on Craig Claiborne. And I actually emailed John T. Edge, director of Southern Foodways Alliance. And John T. said, oh, yeah, this is a really good topic. And, oh, by the way, Southern Foodways Alliance is just doing a program on Craig Claiborne in the same week that you're doing a program. They will have a program tomorrow night at the Astor Center. And we have jointly decided that this is Craig Claiborne Week, and that we're delighted that this is the topic that we could both work on and we could work on together and mutually beneficial. So for both of us, we appreciate that very much. John T. Edge will be our first speaker. He is, as many of you know, contributing editor to Gourmet, author of The Southern Belly. How many of you have read his column, United Taste, in the New York Times? Did all of your hands go up? They now have yesterday's issue of the New York Times, and they're pulling it out to see your column in there. But I just wanted you to know that he just finished a new book. The new book will probably be titled Truck Food. Our second speaker is Betty Fussell, and we're delighted to welcome Betty back for a second time. Thank you very much for coming. Betty is the author of The Story of Corn and Raising Steaks. She has just finished another book. Will be out in the fall, is that correct?
No, this is in process.
Still in process.
So is mine. I'm not finished.
But he's not finished yet.
You can't write as quickly as you.
Come into my food writing class. We can work with you on that, all right? But she has a fascinating title for the next book. It's How to Cook a Coyote. So I look forward to reading that, and that's wonderful. Ann Mendelson, our third speaker, is also a contributing editor to Gourmet and a frequent writer for a number of other publications. Her Milk book is out. Do we have copies of? We do have copies of Milk and Raising Steaks in the back, just for your information, in case you would like to buy them and get them autographed. Anne also is working on a new book, and it's not finished either. Do you have it with you?
Begun.
She hasn't even begun. But the title is fascinating, Chinese Diaspora in America. So I look forward to that as well. Molly ONeill, the former New York Times columnist and author of the New York Cookbook, she has finished. She told me she finished this. She told me she finished this. I believe her when she says she finished this. A new book coming out probably next year, is that correct? Or, yeah, one big table, and she says it's actually good. So I don't, that's what she told me. I just believe what she has to say. David Leite is the publisher-editor-in-chief of Leite's Culinaria, and he's the author of a new book, which will be out August 15th. He's got it finished. I just want you to know that. And it's his first book, The New Portuguese Table, Exciting Flavors from Europe's Western Coast. So I look forward to that, too, when that comes out. Thank you. John T.
All right. Thanks, Andy. Thanks for the warm welcome. My role tonight, as I see it, and I believe as Andy saw it in assigning me this, is token Southerner. And that seems appropriate for, as you know, Mr. Claiborne was a Southerner. I'm going to tell you a couple of short stories and try to sketch why the South mattered in his career and in his life. Now, during a 1957 job interview, Turner Catledge, who was at that time the managing editor of the New York Times, asked Craig Claiborne where he had attended college. Mississippi State, Claiborne replied. In hopes of capitalizing upon a provincial bond, Claiborne, a fellow native of the Magnolia State, amplified his drawl and swallowed his consonants. Not Mississippi State, Claiborne later recalled, but Mississippi State. Claiborne's response wasn't wholly disingenuous. He did attend the college for 1 year, after which he packed his belongings and fled the Deep South, bound for the University of Missouri in Columbia. During the decades that followed, he remained a Southern expatriate, oftentimes burdened by conflicted notions of his place and of his people. In 1957, however, with his dream job as food editor of the New York Times in the balance, Claiborne played the dutiful son of the South. Born in the Mississippi Delta town of Sunflower, reared in nearby Indianola, he played the part well. 3 days later, the telephone call came, and Claiborne got the job. Claiborne was born in 1920. When the Great Depression hit Mississippi, it hit hard, especially the Mississippi Delta. His father was a landholder and banker. He had lost nearly everything. Out of economic necessity, the family moved from their comfortable home in Sunflower to a succession of lesser dwellings in Indianola, where Claiborne's mother, whom many of you know this piece of the puzzle, Miss Kathleen, ran a boarding house and assumed responsibility for the family finances. Claiborne's Mississippi boyhood was atypical. He had no desire to hunt. He hated getting dirty. He yearned for escape. He found refuge in an unsurprising place, the kitchen. It is where I spent my childhood, he said. Now, the South of Claiborne's youth had been a place of codified manners and mores. He chafed under that yoke and in turn directed much of his anger at his mother, Miss Kathleen, whom he said both smothered and emasculated him. As an adult, Claiborne broke off relations with his mother, a decision that resulted in his tandem estrangement from the South. When sociologist John Dollard, who wrote one of the pioneering sociological studies of the American South and wrote it about Indianola, when Dollard, who his mother, Miss Kathleen, had hosted Dollard when he was doing research for this book, when Dollard called Claiborne, this is 1967, and he asked Claiborne, now, when I'm going to Indianola, who should I look up? Who should I inquire? Who should I visit with? Claiborne said, I hadn't been there in 20 years. I don't know. He had this love of his place and this kind of loathing of his place. Although Miss Kathleen, for much of his life, remained out of sight, she was never out of mind. Claiborne often referred to her in his writing and brought her up unbidden in interviews. Among other recipes, he made her chicken spaghetti recipe famous. It has remained throughout many years in the world of food a special favorite, wrote Claiborne in his memoir, A Feast Made for Laughter. Food offered Claiborne a way home eventually. Recognized as the nation's foremost cookery arbiter, late in his career, he was free at last to embrace his roots. He wrote a book, and I believe we have copies of it here, Craig Claiborne's Southern Cooking. And in writing that book, he kind of gained passage back to his mother's table. Meanwhile, the South gained kind of an advocate of its native region. Claiborne once called the South the vastest and most varied of all traditional regional cooking is found in the American South. Claiborne believed that great talent could be found throughout the region, surely in the professional kitchen, but also in the home. In this book, Craig Claiborne's Southern Cooking, he showcased both Bill Neal, the iconic North Carolina chef, but also home cooks like Sybil Arendt, the wife of a Mississippi catfish farmer. Claiborne laid laurels at both of those people's feet, both of those cooks' feet, and introduced Times readers to those folks. And he kind of built a level playing field in his writing and said working class and upper class matter both. And I'm going to close by trying to kind of, we're going to spend a lot of time tonight, I think, talking about Claiborne and his influence on journalism. And since my role is as a token Southerner, I'm going to talk about the way his influence as a journalist lifted up one Southerner, the way Claiborne paying attention to this one cook kind of changed Southern cookery, as I would see it. And I'll start again with a scene like we began the first one. On May 30, 1985, Craig Claiborne rapped at the screen door of a one-bedroom apartment in the Piedmont Mill village of Carborough, North Carolina. Bill Neal, the 34-year-old chef at Crook's Corner, a funky bistro in the adjacent university town of Chapel Hill, met him at the door and ushered the kingmaker into his narrow galley kitchen. After the two Southerners exchanged obligatory pleasantries, Neal turned his attention to boning quail and shelling shrimp. Claiborne pulled up a stool, plopped his typewriter on the top of a busted water heater, and began to peck out a story. 6 weeks later, Neal awoke to a fusillade of phone calls from well-wishers. Claiborne's article declared Neal to be a genius at the stove. What's more, Claiborne gave voice to Neal's contention that the regional dishes of this country are as worthy of preservation as the nation's monuments and architecture. In that same piece, Claiborne included a recipe. Anybody imagine what it is? Shrimp and grits, exactly. In the wake of that visit, Bill Neal was canonized as kind of the thinking man chef. And I would argue that the 20th century's most widely embraced pan-Southern restaurant dish was made by Claiborne saying, this matters, this is a great dish. And then restaurants think, well, food cost is pretty good on that too. Nonetheless, that to me is a great example of Claiborne's impact both upon the South and as a Southerner. Thank you.
Thank you, John T. Betty?
I'm going to do just a very personal take on Claiborne, and I can demonstrate this by the New York Times cookbook, which I still use, of course. I'm only 7 years older than are 7 years younger than Claiborne. God. I'm advancing very fast. But it's important to me, I mean, because I shared a particular time with him. And therefore, my take on it has to do with that time. We were both small town hicks, and we grew up in the Depression. We were both poor and kind of isolated, and we both came of age during World War II. Very, very important. And I have two distinct images when I think of him. One, he's this sort of permanent Cheshire cat grin, and he's in his kitchen in the Hamptons or near East Hampton on Clamshell Avenue, well named, and he's showing off his tandoori oven. He's in bliss. The other image is the same smile, but it's kind of fixed in place. He reels in drunk an hour late for an appointment with me in his apartment in the Salisbury on 57th Street in New York. Now, both were very glamorous places for a yokel from Sunflower, Mississippi. I interviewed him in both places around 1980 when I was doing researching for Masters of American Cooking, my first food book. But I'd first met him in my kitchen in Princeton, New Jersey, when he came a few years earlier, and he was doing profiles on home cooks. And it was just astonishing to me because he had no dictaphone. He just took a few notes, asked a lot of questions, and remarkably, he was sort of out the next day. The speed mattered for him as a journalist. It was in the living section then. That's when women's cooking had turned to living. A very exciting moment. And you'll hear a lot more about, he was as a first male food editor for a place like the New York Times. He did a lot of pieces on home cooking as well as on restaurant reviewing. Now, my husband and I had just remodeled our kitchen, and we were very, very proud of it. And it was a little touch of Provence in Princeton, we hoped. But it was important that my husband didn't cook, but he did read, and he actually read Claiborne. That was an even more important first. Men read this guy. Okay, by 1980, the cooking revolution had really, in this country, had made incredible changes. And Craig was one of the first of the four revolutionists, as I call them, to whom I attributed these changes. MFK Fisher, the ones who you're doing, James Beard, Julia Child, and Craig. Okay. And of them all, Craig seems to me to be the one who did most to change the idea of taste and our evolving taste. And whether it was cooking at home or eating out, because he covered both areas. That was a very important connection. So he was the one who really aimed straight at the home cook in a way that was that we couldn't imagine doing this. It was quite unlike Julia, to whom we had to address a whole different set of faculties, in getting that glorious dolorf in our home cook, in our kitchen. No, he was doing a different kind of thing, like swimps and wits, And what I shared with Claiborne essentially was this time slot, the kind of explosion, like a hydrogen bomb, which is important to the time, as a nation of Puritans discovered that food was a pleasure, and that, like sex, you could do it at home. And he kind of bridged the gap between doing it yourself and paying someone else to do it. And he used to say that his three favorite things were music, sex, and food, in that order. And all three began to rock and roll in the 50s. So we had not put those three things together as a culture. Claiborne liked to say that our palate revolution began in June 17th, 1947, when Pan Am launched its first round-the-world ticket for $1,700. Now, that was a lot more expensive than going on a boat, which you could make the same trip. But boat travel was really, really cheap, and everybody was on that boat thereby. So this is part of the food revolution. And Craig, as you say, escaped his minister father and his mothering mother and joined the Navy and saw the world literally. When he graduated in 42 from U of Missouri, he had majored in advertising, which is also important. He donned his Navy uniform and, in effect, never wanted to take it off. And he said, I was always a bit of a snob. So he loved the uniform. He loved the Navy. He loved living in style. He wasn't in the trenches. He was in the Navy, in Morocco and Hawaii and the South Pacific. And when the war ended, he did some PR work in Chicago and New York, but only until he could save enough money to move to France for a year in 1949. Now, 1949 was the year the musical South Pacific came on. And I just happened to see it, the revival, last Sunday. And to my delight, there were others in the audience besides me who had seen 1949, Ezio Pinza and Mary Martin. Those of you who did not see it may have trouble realizing just how isolated America was before the war, all those decades before the war. And it was only one ripple on that deep ocean of American fear of the other. So that at the time that linked Huns and Japs and Chinks and Blacks together. That has not changed all that much. So you have no idea how narrow the view was from Sunflower and from Riverside, California. Claiborne re-enlisted, therefore, the moment he could for the Korean War and went to the South Pacific, and where he decided that he was going to put together the two things he loved most, writing and cooking. And he said, at that moment, I decided I was going to become the food editor of the New York Times. I'm not sure that that's true, but that's what he said. So he prepared himself by enrolling in as you all know, a professional hotel school in Switzerland. And that, because he wanted to, he knew he had to know the elements of haute cuisine and haute service. Now, he didn't really want to do either of those things, but he wanted to be the consumer. He was the arch consumer. And he would learn the rules, and they would, of course, be French. So you all know the story of how he got the job at the Times, well told again. And
Sorry.
once he, oh, that's right. But it was Claiborne who connected the home kitchen to the restaurant, and that had not happened before in quite this way. And both were coded to some standards of taste, which we also were new to America at that time. And he really created a model, or maybe the model for restaurant reviewing, which is also new, and this has been said many times, the way in which you, this was to be divorced from the advertising pages. It was not a PR. The restaurant reviewer was not a paid PR for the restaurant, and you had to go many times anonymously and bring friends, sample as much of the menu as you can. And that may sound very simple, but for a while I was the restaurant reviewer for the Times for New Jersey, and believe me, this was torment. It was the worst period I ever spent in my life. So Claiborne, it took its toll. You eat out 3 times a day like that. It does take its toll. His goal was to make reviews objective, and in comparison to the Times, he did, because when James Beard was asked what his favorite restaurant was, he would always say, well, it's the one where they know me best. So Claiborne made talk about food newsworthy in a way that nobody else had. And I think because it became an index of taste at a time when we were, as a country, flexing our muscles as a new superpower. And we wanted to find our place in the world. And Americans are always worried about taste anyway, because it is an index of class. And we always worry about class. And Claiborne wonderfully shook up the hierarchies, the usual hierarchies, as you're saying. And he gave Lutece a 1-star, and he also gave Chock full of Nuts a 1-star. I certainly remember my husband's astonishment on first reading Claiborne's restaurant reviews in the Times when we were eating ourselves selling in France in the 1960s, because travel was so cheap, and we were using the Michelin like a divining rod. But here was an American talking about food in a way that was actually, my husband, who fancied himself as a literary critic and said, hey, he's doing genuine criticism. That was the highest of my husband's hierarchies. Criticism in an easy, authoritative style, and on a subject as non-literary as food. And I really believe that one of the great attractions of Claiborne was that he was a good writer. And you all know that Claiborne teamed up in 1960 with that young chef he met in Pavillon named Pierre Fanet. Now, this seemed a perfect marriage of complementary skills. The Frenchman, who was really a professional cook, and the American, who was a professional writer. Together, they could translate, and did, any recipe in the world. And it was not just the new boys at the time, the big guys like Bocuse and Trois Gras and Ducasse, but cooks from any cuisine. Marcella Hazan, Virginia Lee, really important, the kind of first big Chinese cookbook. Oops, sorry. Mary Jaffrey, Diana Kennedy, Paul Prudhomme. And they did 7 books in 10 years, almost equaling that. Before Claiborne retired officially in 1970 to collaborate on a newsletter with Frenet. And they went broke, and so Claiborne returned to the Times in 1976 with Frenet in tow, and they did many columns and cookbooks together in their, what I call their recipe factory in the Hamptons. And this is a very grand kitchen, and it was part of Craig's home, but it was not in any way a typical home kitchen. In this, they staged elaborate feasts on ritual holidays like New Year's and July 4th, etc., for the rich and famous in Hamptons. And so, both of these, Frenet, they were both Hicks. Frenet was from Thunder, France, which kind of matches Sunflower, Mississippi. And they were, in my mind, kind of twin Horatio Algers. Responsible for the Horatio Alger dreams of kids across America who wanted to become rich and famous by means of a restaurant or a cooking show. And that was then a new route. Look at us now. But food was not yet hot news in America until Claiborne. So the grand climactic was Claiborne and Frenet's famous dinner for 2 in 1975 when they spent $4,000 on a 25-course dinner with 11 wines at Chez Denise in Paris, sponsored by American Express. $4,000 doesn't sound that much today. You could spend that at Per Se, but then it was a fortune. And maybe this meal marked the end of America's first leap from Puritanism to decadence. Claiborne hadn't paused at hedonism, mere hedonism. He hadn't paused at all, in fact. Just before this extravaganza, he had called Arthur Gelb, at the New York Times, at midnight and said, "Arthur, I'm in jail. Get help." He'd been arrested in the Hamptons for drunk driving. And this was not the image of soigné connoisseurship he'd constructed in his prose. But he went public with this story on himself in his autobiography, A Feast Made for Laughter. That was in 1982. In the same book, he came out of the closet. This was an important moment in time because it was not ordinarily that a big authority in the New York Times came out and said, actually, I'm gay. The Times had long known he had a problem with alcohol. They'd known about his taste for young men. And everybody in the Hamptons knew this too. And so that he wasn't exactly keeping it secret. He flaunted it. He looked for trouble, grinning. So I think of him as a boy who felt morbidly wimpy and humiliated. He sort of sought what he most feared, which was public shame. When he published his memoir, he asked me if I'd review it for the Times. Now, we know that officially that never, ever happens. But in fact, he couldn't, nobody in the Times could do it because he was a writer and it was a conflict of interest. And I was a freelancer, but I was not an employee. So he also knew I was sympathetic to his story of how his father had initiated him sexually in his own bed. Claiborne was a good storyteller, and I knew I'd like the book. And in my review, I put him in the picaresque tradition of Huck Finn. For me, that self-deprecating humor was not just Southern, it was also a journalistic strategy of bringing his reader with him. So I saw him kind of posing as the Walter Mitty of the food world, using that stance of naive goofball or yokel to get the reader on his side. And I think that's why he was so successful in introducing Americans to a larger world than they had lived in before. Introducing us to the other in the form of cooking and eating in other countries and cuisines and races and cultures. So in a way, he was a rerun of South Pacific. I think of him as both Nellie from Small Rock, Arkansas, and the sophisticated cosmopolite meal. And unlike my other 3 masters of American cookery, Craig never quite got his act together in coordinating the contradictions of yokelhood and celebrityhood. And like many another newly made celebrity in America, he couldn't bridge public fame and private shame. So in a self-destructive way, he drove away those who loved him most. He quarreled permanently with Pierre when Frenet became a household name, the 60-Minute Gourmet. Now, Frenet died at age 75 in 1996 in the bosom of his family in Southampton, Claiborne died at age 79 in 2000, alone in his rooms at the Salisbury.
Thank you, Betty. Ann?
Can everybody hear me? Andy, in his wisdom, asked me to explain Craig Claiborne's context in the food world. Okay, Andy asked me to talk about Craig Claiborne's context in the food world. Now, for anybody who was not around at the time, like me and Betty, you have to go with gun and camera back into the remote past. And I would say that you also have to disabuse yourself of the notion that his importance lay in making such and such chefs or cookbook writers famous, although he did that, or in making a nation of dolts into the United States of arugula, although he made a contribution there as well. His career was inseparably bound up with the New York Times at a particular stage of its history. And it was bound up with sex roles as perceived in popular journalism before women's lib reared its head. The fall of 1957 saw one of the Times's occasional conscious decisions to make news instead of just reporting it. The paper announced that the replacement for its longtime food editor, Jane Nickerson, was going to be a man. A man! It was the talk of the town. It was a publicity coup. At that time, newspapers didn't have dedicated food sections. Recipes and food news appeared usually one day a week as part of something called the Woman's Page. In the Times, this page was headed Food, Fashions, Family, Furnishings, the 4 Fs. It contained the lion's share of the lifestyle journalism, although that phrase had not been invented, that appeared in the Times before 1976. As at other papers, the 4 Fs page was a service journalism ghetto for women. Except for some fashion reporters, the writers had little prestige, little name recognition, even when they were given bylines. In '57, the people chiefly responsible for Times food coverage were Jane Nickerson, who was leaving to go to Florida, the assistant food editor, June Owen, and the Times home economist, Ruth Casa Emeos, who ran the test kitchen. Yes, the Times had its own home economist and its own test kitchen at that time. Now, these were serious, hardworking people. They were knowledgeable people, but they were women, and hence semi-invisible. Appointing a man had been the subject of some discussion among the Times higher-ups. Apparently, the clinching argument for this revolutionary step came from the editor of the 4 Fs page, Elizabeth Penrose Hawkins, who asserted that the best chefs had always been men. This thinking seemed highly apt at the time. And the result was an outstanding success, because from the first, Claiborne managed to write for the Times in a manner calculated to reinforce the perception that things are more important when men do them. Nobody would have invoked the word chef in connection with Jane Nickerson's work. Neither she nor her colleagues ever aspired to the status of an oracle. Claiborne aspired to it almost at once, and he showed a talent for assuming it. He could write, "To my mind, one of the world's most elegant dishes is," or, "I consider this book wholly admirable in its authenticity," and have people thinking, well, praise from Sir Hubert is praise indeed. He was also a quick but hard worker. He was a writer of real stylistic gifts, as Betty has pointed out. He carried off an air of authority gracefully, not overdoing it, knowing how to be funny or self-deprecating at the right moment. He successfully established, and I think this is probably the crucial fact about him, at least from my point of view, he successfully established a certain kind of relationship with an audience that is possible, let's say was possible, only at a newspaper with weekly features. He instinctively knew how to make himself very good company, very sophisticated, polished company at the breakfast table. People unfolded their paper over the morning coffee, wondering what he would write about that week. You remember. I think there are probably many people in this room who remember. Would it be a bountifully stocked kitchenware shop with a curmudgeonly owner? I think that rings some bells of memory. A recipe for homemade apple strudel. A piece about a Manhattan home cook born in New Delhi. About a place where you could buy imported French mustard. To me, and people like me, who followed Claiborne's every word in the early years, all this was filled with a sense of discovery that it would be impossible to convey to today's foodies. And it was all completely wrapped up in the context of the times, and the times. The most important thing about Claiborne, I think, is that he knew how to talk the talk in a way that woman food journalists of the day didn't, and to make it appealing, to make us wish that we could be there talking the talk. He also had the advantage that in the late 50s and early 60s, the Times addressed a relatively homogeneous audience with, dare I mention it, longer attention spans than Gen X and Gen Y, and with a narrower range of experiences to focus attention on. He was the earliest food celebrity in capital letters, as we understand the term now, but before the cult of celebrity had become such a pervasive and debasing influence. Because celebrity itself was less cheap half a century ago, his power to confer celebrity on anything or anyone that he noticed in print meant something that it would be hard to explain to anyone under the age of 40. But, a very large but, it was the Times that had made him somebody instead of nobody in the first place. Claiborne didn't like admitting it, but he never succeeded in reinventing himself as a brand name, independently of the Times. He tried and struck out. He flourished for a while, thanks to an inherently ephemeral medium. In at least one regard, his influence was so dramatic temporarily that according to one of his successors, Mimi Sheraton, when Claiborne first tried to leave the Times in 1972, no woman writer was interviewed for the job of food editor. The powers that be, or that were, apparently thought, what was the vital ingredient in our previously successful recipe? Hey, must have been maleness. Unfortunately, the 1970s turned out not to be a recap of 1950s sexual politics. And in most other ways, it seems plain in hindsight that Claiborne's influence simply wasn't destined to be a lasting one in all ways. The only one of his many cookbooks that ever seemed likely to qualify for classic status was the New York Times cookbook, which was published in 1961 and held its own against the major kitchen Bibles for a number of years before suffering the usual eclipse of cookbooks when the fashions change. The fans who swore by it for half a generation or longer were mostly unaware that many dozens and perhaps hundreds, you would need a computer search to do an accurate count, but many of the recipes copyrighted under his name in that book had actually been the work of Jane Nickerson, June Owen, and Ruth Casa-Emmaus years before Claiborne joined the paper. Still, I think there are a few reasonable claims to a lasting Claiborne legacy. One of them, I would say, is that although he didn't know it, he helped inaugurate the current era of food chatter and food celebrity, for better or worse. The era in which everybody knows how to talk the talk. Everybody knows how to strike the pose. Everybody knows how to sound knowing. On a happier note, his explorations of the cities and, to an extent, the nation's ethnic diversity at a time when, in truth, we were comparatively non-diverse, helped food lovers appreciate real diversity when it came along, courtesy of massive immigration after 1965. In the same vein, the mere act of his lending his name to the Chinese cookbook, written with Virginia Lee, published in 1972, gave tremendous early impetus to the food establishment's eventual move away from the stiflingly Eurocentric and mostly Francocentric vision of the gastronomic universe that it had previously been wedded to.
Goodness.
Thank you, Ann. Molly?
Hi. Boy, I don't even know where to begin. Those were wonderful, wonderful pieces. I met Craig slightly later. By the time that I met him in 1982 at a charity ball in Jackson, Mississippi, he was holding forth about being a Southerner, and I was just starting writing about food and terrified that I knew very little about the Deep South, and was taking every charity gig possible to get me there and learn a little bit. The first night we met, he held forth for several hours about the South. And the second time we met, I was taking him out to dinner, and he asked me what I'd learned about the South because he really needed to catch up. So by 1982, a number of Craig's demons had begun to eclipse the Craig who we know and love. One of the things that I'd like to talk about is his generosity, and also the idea that although Craig may not last as a book name, and indeed there's pretty good evidence that he will not, for a number of reasons, what Craig did inside the New York Times is, to my mind, his legacy. Now, I had a bit of a snit when Andy first wrote to me, I don't know, months and months ago, and said, would you talk about Craig Claiborne and the invention of food journalism? I couldn't believe it. I had just come off of 5 years of reading everything that has been written about food in America for the Library of America collection, and I've been traveling the country for 10 years taking oral histories of cooks. And the idea that Craig Claiborne invented food journalism was beyond me, even though I adore him. Craig Claiborne did not invent food journalism. There are a lot of places where we could lay that title, but in fact, people have written about food from the very first explorers in the United States, and they've written about it with a contagious excitement and with a ton of judgment and with the desire to share an aspect of private life and a desire to explain who they are by sharing their taste. Craig was one in a line of a very, very, very long history in the United States. He came right after a woman named Clementine Paddleford, who, basically Craig ate Clem's lunch. You know, Clementine Paddleford owned food journalism. in this country. This woman was out of her mind. She wanted to know how Americans ate and how Americans lived. She couldn't get to a lot of these places, so the dame goes and gets herself a pilot's license. And she's flying around Kansas and, Idaho and interviewing people who grow grain and talking to people who grow different types of cattle and doing things that today we feel very great about doing, that we're really getting to the bottom. I mean, I used to feel great about doing that until I went and read her papers. And 50 years before I even knew how to type, she was out there in her plane, gathering these recipes and cataloging them and making relationships that were based on nothing but her own power and her celebrity and her deep, deep charm. She published these recipes and really owned that world in the United States for, we could argue, but I would say 30 years. And then along came Craig. And along came Craig at a time at which the New York Times was becoming the paper. And Clementine Paddleford was on the wrong horse. She was 63 years old. She was not cute enough to get hired at a new paper. She was a very high-ticket item at that time. And Craig rode into town, much younger, much cuter, a little bit of exotic, and absolutely a well-trained journalist. He also had a beautiful lyrical flair. In addition to the recipes that we know from home economists and the people who ran the test kitchen on the 8th floor of the New York Times when it was located at 43rd Street, Craig has a lot of recipes that were troublingly similar to Clementine Paddleford's recipes. Am I saying that he took her recipes? No, but I do think that he followed her footsteps and he went the same places, and that she blazed a lot of trails. And as he was cutting his teeth at the New York Times, she basically was his Baedeker. And at the, it had to, you all know the food world, it had to really get going. And at the end, they couldn't be in the same room together. And Craig was quite high-handed with Clem. And she has really not lasted as far as a reputation, though her work has lasted. Craig's work at the New York Times has lasted in this way because he was male, because he was the food writer of record as the paper was establishing its power base, becoming the paper. And because all of this was happening in the great boon of the middle class after the war, Craig brought a new sensibility, and he brought the kind of rigor that had formerly been lacking. Not because the women who did the stories and did the recipes didn't have the rigor. They had it. What happened was that women had always, in the history of American food writing, basically women stayed in kitchens and made up recipes and talked about their private lives and talked about their dinner parties and talked about trying to make dinner, on 10 cents with a stone for 85 people. And men got to have these really cool expense accounts and go bounding around the world, riding their own rising cholesterol. And it didn't matter if they knew anything about food or not, and many did not. But they learned, because this, ladies and gentlemen, is not rocket science. If you consume enough calories and think about it enough, you eventually learn a few things. I never took food writing seriously. And in the last several years, I've come to take it a lot more seriously because I understood that I, without realizing it, have learned something about the field in 25 years. And I will not reveal the caloric content of those. What Craig did was, because he was a male, because he was elegant, because he had a great expense account, this is very, very important, and I'll tell you why in a minute, he was able to bring the kind of rigorous discipline and enterprise that the New York Times was building its reputation on into what we called soft news, or the women's sports pages. And he did that by insisting that he had to go to restaurants 4 times, and therefore he needed X number of dollars in his expense account. And when you have X number of dollars in your expense account, 150,000 of them a year, you take out all of the people in power at the paper. You're expected to. And you develop a power base within the paper, which means that your real estate in the paper moves up, which means that the way you're talked about moves up. And it's kind of a snowball effect. Craig was seen by people in the paper as having invented food journalism because people in the paper didn't read other papers. What mattered was the New York Times. And so Craig mattered. He mattered dramatically. And he did a wonderful, wonderful job in many ways. He brought a rigor to restaurant criticism that we really had not seen before, a kind of scientific sensibility that, you know, he got away with some of the fluff, and he brought this idea that there was a logic to a restaurant and that you could grade it on a sliding scale and you could give it a star, and that meant something. And in fact, it does mean something. At one point, a restaurateur could go to the bank with their stars, and it meant a great deal. Craig could be thanked for that. He was not the only one, but he could certainly be thanked for it. He also helped create a style of recipe writing, recipe testing, and recipe vetting that had not really occurred before at the paper. It had been individual people, you know, testing away and putting these recipes in the paper. There was never forethought. There was never a news hook. There were seasonal hooks. Everything was attached to the market, what's in the market. And that came to us from the 19th century. It no longer mattered by the mid-20th century, but it was still the driving force behind how the stories were pitched and framed. Craig came in there and gave something newsier, more social, something that you felt like you had just had a nice meal with a smart person. Many people had the meal at breakfast. I was a chef at that time, and I tended to have it at 4 o'clock when my station was set up and I could read. The second time that I met Craig and he asked me what I had learned about the South, I began telling him the little tiny bit I had learned about the South, which is I'll never understand because I wasn't born there. But, and in the subsequent years, when I was a restaurant critic and had a really big expense account, and he did not have a big expense account and was in very, very bad shape, we got to know each other much better. Not because of my charm, my intelligence, or my companionship, but mostly because of my expense account. And he was intensely generous with me in the year before I went to the New York Times and in the first year that I was at the New York Times. And he basically told me how to run the magazine and how to imagine it and what it had to do and what notes you had to strike. And he was absolutely right. And I did pretty much exactly what he told me. In my areas of failure were the times when I didn't do what he had told me and tried to think that I could reinvent it. During that time, Craig's alcoholism had increased dramatically. The first call to his editor was followed by monthly escapades of increasing horror, and the paper was bailing him out. Let's just say that if we had the laws today if our laws of today were active in 1986, he would have been felonized, and he would have been locked up, and he would not have gotten out. It wouldn't have mattered that he was at the New York Times. He was constantly being arrested for drunken driving and disorderly behavior, and the paper continuously were, trying to help him in the way that people tried to help before alcoholism and drug addiction were really understood. Like, Craig, take a week off and get a grip. And, we'll pay the fines and we'll do this and we'll do that. Meanwhile, the paper had become quite wealthy on Craig. Whatever we find wrong with his work, and there is a lot to find wrong with his work, the fact is, no book out of the New York Times has ever made the bucks that that book made, and he did not make a cent in royalties. He made his salary. And no other paper has ever had that sort of strong identification because he was the one who mattered. No one could command the ad sales that the New York Times could command. When I took over the restaurant, or rather the magazine column, it was said that the ads facing that page paid for the foreign report. Well, it wasn't because of me. It was because of the legacy that he established at that paper. That was the most expensive real estate in the newspaper, other than the Tiffany ad right inside the front, the daily paper, front page of the daily paper. He did not profit from that. He lived the life, and that's what was the most interesting and the most important thing to him, was belonging, was finding a place where he belonged, and then not being able to maintain that place, not being able to maintain a zone of comfort. He did not quite die alone. He died surrounded by people who did not have his best interest at heart, which is, I think, worse than dying alone. And by that time, he really was not entirely copacetic. He wasn't in full control of his faculties. One of the things that is the most touching to me about living in New York City, and any time I leave makes me want to come back, is that during the last 3 years of his life, Craig Claiborne was fed by the chefs and restaurateurs who he made. The New York Times didn't feed him, but restaurateurs made sure that there was wine in that house and that there was beautiful food in that house every single day of the week. They never forgot their debt. And that makes me, so proud to be part of the food profession. There was one other thing that I wanted to mention, but I think I'm going to put it off because we're going to talk a little bit now about, if I met Craig today, what would he teach me? What would he advise me? What he advised me to do was have enterprise, be rigorous, know more, learn more than anybody else, and write as clearly and elegantly as possible. Make sure you say one funny thing. Make sure you say one power trippy thing that puts people in their place. And make sure that you leave some question. Those were his 3 pieces of advice to me, and they are the 3 pieces of advice that I pass on to younger writers. However, what Craig held out as the secret to great food writing, which was knowledge, is now not exactly the same. What Craig held out as the aspiration. When he met me, I was at New York Newsday, and he just kept saying, "You're going to the Times, you're going to the Times, you're going to the Times." I could have done a little jig to his dance of how I was going to the Times. I was going to the Times. That's no longer the case. There are so many various ways to get at visibility. And David, our next speaker, is someone who's really explored those ways and has some thoughts on what that means for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly.
I have the task of talking about the future of journalism, and the flat-out answer is no one knows what the hell that is. No one. I spoke to food journalists, I spoke to publishers, both online and in print. I talked to some people in Silicon Valley. Everyone has their own points of view. Everyone has their own thoughts on what this should be, and their own personal agendas. The interesting thing that I found was food writers had the most depressing point of view of the future. The most optimistic point of view were the technology people. And I think they must have something or know something that we don't as journalists and writers. Maybe they are well vested in their companies, such as Google and things, but I found that to be interesting. So first of all, raise your hand if you have a blog or website. Keep your hand up if you're making money on it. Good, I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that. I'm really glad. You want to tell me your CPMs? I'm glad to hear that. This really is not an issue of the future of journalism, I believe. I don't. I think it's an issue of two things. I think it's an economic issue, and I think it's a technology issue. If it weren't for technology changing the way that it has, this would not have happened. We would not have had this influx, this democratization of food writing. It wouldn't have happened. And of course, it's economic. Everybody wants to make money. Everybody wants to keep money at the New York Times or at the LA Times, and there's bloggers who want to get the money over to where they are. And so everyone wants to parse that dollar up as much as they can. So thinking that way, because it took a while to kind of figure out what I was actually going to say, when I approached some of these people, some interesting things happened. So first of all, the good news is Russ Parsons spoke at the Symposium for Professional Food Writers recently, and he said something which I think has been his mantra for years, which is, to quote him, people are always going to want good stories and there will always be a market for them. That will never go away. I think that will never change and that will never go away. But the reason why he even had to say that, and the reason why I'm here talking about this, is because of technology, because things have changed so dramatically. And it has forever changed the face of journalism, and I think it's going to continue to change the face of journalism. Now, technology has done certain things for journalism, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now, the good, I think, first of all, it's made our jobs a lot easier in a certain sense. You can be anywhere in the United States, get on a computer, get on LexisNexis, and find out stuff that you need. I was in Portugal, and I would shoot someone an email, and I'd get the answer back in 30 minutes, instead of having to write a letter in the old days and wait 4 weeks for it to come over or get lost. So it's made our lives easier, which is a wonderful thing about technology. It's also changed the delivery of that story that John says everyone wants to the market he says is wanting it. I mean, for instance, even 5 years ago, who would have thought that John T.'s articles or Ann Mendelson's articles or anyone's articles on this panel, we could get on our Blackberries and read them. Or I could, one of Molly's recipes, I could simply send to my iPhone the ingredients list, go to Fairway tonight and shop off of my iPhone. I mean, that is cool. I like that, that's cool. Because it takes all the stuff that we do, parses it for a different audience. So I think those are some of the great things that it's done. Now, some of the bad stuff is technology has flooded the market when it comes to food writing. That market, he says, is wanting material. There's so much more out there. And according to author and food writer Diane Jacob, who wrote Will Write for Food, she said that we talked on the phone 2 days ago, she said that she found that there were over 40,000 food blogs and websites out there. Now, I think that's lowballing.
That's much more.
That's lowballing. Yeah, lowballing, because that was a number that I found a year and a half ago. I think we're somewhere between 60 and maybe 80,000 easy food blogs or food websites out there. And she did say something very interesting. She says, this whole thing with Twitter and Facebook, it's a lot of noise, and we're all adding noise to a very noisy environment, so no one can hear anything because all we're hearing is noise. And I think that's true. I think that is very true. But the internet is the great democratizer. It has allowed everyone to become a writer and a publisher, whether they should be or not. That is not for me to judge, nor any of us on this panel. That's not for me to judge. We can try, but we shan't. One of the other things I think is one of the bad things technology has done for food writing and for writing in general is that technology is shaping the story itself. What's happening is, I don't know if this has happened to any of you, but what I have found is I've had editors say to me, do you think there are too many words? Do you think maybe we can do some of this in an audio piece? Or can we do video? Or can we do a slideshow? Is that possible? And I say, not really, but if you are, we're not changing the amount of money I'm getting paid. I mean, I try to live, because this is about economics after all. And I mean, they want to deliver the best story. I mean, we've all written for the New York Times and other publications. They want to have the best story possible for their readers, but they want to make money also. And writers want to make money. And then I think the downright ugly, in my mind, what technology has done when it comes to writing, food writing, is that the technology is changing how we read as a conscious act. And this really bothers me very much. Because attention spans, as we know, are significantly shorter, as was mentioned earlier. Readers have what Patrick Cork, who is a technology executive out in the Valley says that we have black hole attention spans, that we get sucked from somewhere and deposited somewhere else. And sometimes it's just because of the technology. You're on a page, you click something, the next thing you know, you're looking at something else and you forgot entirely what you were reading. And that happens to me all the time. Or suddenly you just get lost because there's so much information going on. And it's not just with the web, it's also other things that are happening too. You're reading a book or you're reading an article, something happens on TV, you put it down, you forget about it, it goes in the bin by the toilet, and maybe you see it again in a month and a half. You know, those things are happening because of our attention spans. And so what happens is publishers are having us write shorter pieces. They're having us jazz it up a lot, you know. And I think all of us can or dumbing it down. And I think also one of the things that really does bother me is when an editor says to me, do you think you can take these 4 paragraphs and make 4 bullet points on the side out of them? I mean, that really annoys me. No, I crafted those four paragraphs, hours and hours, to get them down to 1 sentences, you know? So those are some of the things that are happening that I think really makes it unfortunate. Now, Parsons' bottom line, and I got this actually off of Michael Ruhman's blog, so I did use the internet to be able to research part of this, is that the bottom line is that we have to evolve or die. And that applies both to the publication as well as to journalists. I'm going to leave the evolving of publications to publications. I think we as journalists, if you are a journalist in this room or want to be a journalist or plan to be a journalist, have got to evolve. Seth Godin, I never know how to say his name. What is it? Godin, thank you. Said on his blog, aptly named Seth Godin's blog, he wrote, quote, prediction, there will be no significant newspapers printed on newsprint in the US by 2012. Now, do you agree?
It's pretty well known.
Thank you. It's the big groan, but I almost want to say to you, why are you surprised? Companies are going bankrupt, papers are going bankrupt left and right.
There's not that many trees left.
Not that many trees left. And I know everyone, and I talk about this a little bit later, everyone says, you know, I like the idea of holding that tactile sensation. Absolutely. That's because we were born into that. That's changing rapidly. And I'll get to that in a minute. Now, whether you agree with him or not, this will continue to happen. Papers will go, and publications will go more digital. It's just the wave of the future. You can't stop this. And I mean, a couple of reasons. It's more cost effective. I know bloggers, I know website people, me with my website, 10 years old. I have a desk that's about from where Molly is to here, and that's my entire office. That's my international office of Leite's Culinaria. That's where everything happens. And then when I happened to be in Portugal, my desk was my kitchen table. That was the Portugal bureau of Leite's Culinaria. And we have, I think, 250 people working on the site. Wherever they are, that's the wherever they are bureau of Leite's Culinaria. There's practically no overhead. And that's one of the great things. But, no real estate. But what happens is, you know, there comes the Jason Blair effect. I mean, do we want to have journalists at home writing these stories and never having to go anywhere? So there's a balance that has to be very carefully struck. But getting back to the idea of wanting to hold something, one of the reasons why it makes sense is, and this will eventually happen, is we are all getting older. All of us are getting older, no matter how much we want to not admit that, but we are. And we may like holding a newspaper. We may have grown up with newspapers, magazines, and books in our hands, and we like that sensation. But Jane Doe and John Doe being born right now, or being born in 5 years, they're going to be completely indoctrinated into that. They will learn how to read on digital media. They will grow up in schools from day one on digital media. They will go into, anything they do will be done digitally. And they will be, that will be their venue to be able to understand the world, is through digital media. And it makes sense for publications to do that. Does it make sense for journalists is another question. Now, when speaking to some of these people, and I'll kind of go quickly because I know we have time issues, I asked some scenarios of the future of journalism, and some of them I find are rather shocking. And you can make up your own mind. One of them, the first one, is the writer-based scenario, or writer-based publishing, which is what we have right now. That's blogs, that's websites. And in that model, the writer becomes the publisher, the editor, the fact-checker, the ad sales rep for their particular site. But what's interesting now, and I think that there is a movement that's happening. I think some of these websites, blogs, online publications, I don't want to slam blogs because there are some very good ones out there. What's happening is you've got some really established writers starting their own blogs. And they're giving credibility to where once credibility did not exist. Blogs were considered, forgive me if anyone's a blogger here, a joke when they first started. It's like anyone with a computer and half a brain who had dinner could have a blog. But it's gotten better and better and better with some of them. And then some of the really best writers now are pecking away at a keyboard. So that's one model. And of course, money comes in through the advertising, money comes in through sales of books on that particular site or blog. And it also offers something that newspapers, actually, Russ was bemoaning this, that blogs have something that newspapers really have a hard time with, not so much the Times, though, but he said, at least with his publication, this robust dialogue back and forth with the paper. Blogger readers and website readers, if you have the comment thing on, they are ferociously, rabidly, fanatically attached to you. And that builds a readership base, and that builds page views, and that builds impressions, and that gets more money, and that gets you higher and higher in Google rank and all that kind of stuff. That's something that some traditional media, even though they have online presence, don't really know how to work very well, because they're still sitting behind their glass desks, behind their desks, you know, and they're doing things the old way, the old media, and that's changing with a lot of these publications. There's the user-determined content. I found, I was speaking to someone at Book Expo America, a couple of weeks ago, and this gentleman's one of the organizers, and he said that there's a technology out there that either it's going toward this or is already there, where, for instance, let's say I want to know everything about Molly ONeill. I can do a searching on Google, but it's old stuff. What I can do is I can opt into a subscription-based program. I can pick those publications, whether they be print or online. I type in all the different search terms that I want, and they're delivered, but just those. So if there's an article on Molly or on John or anyone, or on Goobers over there, Mr. Peanut Man, and those are delivered to me. And then what they can do is they can collate it into David Leite's, Morning Gazette, and that's all I will see. And that would be a paid for product. Now they're even saying that this can go across cookbooks if cookbook publishers want to do and pay into this, where, let's say you're vegan and you want to have vegan recipes, that you can type in the kind of recipes you want. It can go all the way across Amazon.com. It can pull from, let's say, 64 cookbooks from 28 authors by 11 publishing houses. And then you collate the book, you have it printed out, so you have a hard copy, you have a digital copy, and so therefore you have just what you want, which is lovely. But let's say I only get one recipe in that vegan cookbook. No one's going to buy my book, so maybe I've got 6 cents because my one recipe was sold that one time, versus you buying the book to get that one recipe, and I get $1.10 or whatever it is. And, I can live high off that one. And then this is the one I find truly the most shocking, is what someone called free gift with purchase. You write the book, and then it's put right up on Google Books. The entire book is made available to anyone, anytime, free of charge, which is shocking to me, that to work all that time to have a book free. But what they're saying is where the sales pitch, and I don't know if it's true or not, if it would work, the money that you will get, how you'll be paid, would be that the book comes out, everybody loves it, you're a phenomenal success, you do something like this, and instead of 196, there's 1,096 of you, and I get paid because you want to talk to the guy who wrote that. Or I do a cooking class, and you love the book so much, you want to be with the guy who did that. So it's a big, fat PR kit, and that's how they're looking at it. And for some people, that's not a bad thing. So for some people, they will gladly give their entire book away for that to happen, because they want the attention, they want the fame, they want the reach, they want the broadcast, and that's perfectly fine. And then the last one, which I kind of like actually, I guess because of my background, is the many hats model. It's the multimedia model, multimedia journalism, where basically that there's schools now. There's UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, there's Boston University, so many universities where you can go and you can get a degree in multimedia journalism, where you become the writer, you become the photographer, you become the digital guy, you become what am I missing? the videographer, and then you go somewhere, you go on a trip to France, Paris, and you put together 6 different episodes that you then package and you sell them to websites, whoever they are, and therefore you get money. And then you can lease them or you can sell them whole out. And that's what a lot of young journalists are doing, or intrepid journalists, older intrepid journalists are doing. I'm not that old nor that intrepid to be able to do it. And I find that to be really in keeping, because I think that puts some of the control in your side of the court. But in closing, I mean, the bottom line, and this is a little bit of a point of contention up here, but I think having been in advertising for 18 years, the thing I think what has to happen is advertisers have to understand that online media is just as lucrative as the traditional medias. I mean, if you think about it, and we were talking about this earlier, Molly and I, that Super Bowl commercials are, what, $35 billion for 30 seconds, yet you can get an ad campaign which gives you $2 per 1,000 views, which is nothing. So until they realize that that's just as lucrative as television, as radio, and as newspapers, and as if the publications become leaner and meaner and basically start working differently, until then, I don't think journalists are going to get the longer end of the stick.
We don't have a lot of time, but there are some in the audience who knew Craig Claiborne, and I promised you that I would give you a brief opportunity to talk. Zarella Martinez, are you willing to? Back there.
Where's Zarella? There she is.
I'm so happy that I have the opportunity to be one of the people that Craig discovered and made, and he saw something in me just like he saw things in Wolfgang Puck and Matter Jaffrey and Diana Kennedy. And he took me and made a fairy tale come true for me. But I think that what Craig did that was different from what other people did is that he picked people, whether consciously or subconsciously, who he knew were going to be able to deal with the exposure and were going to make this particular field of his grow. And you can see it in Matter still producing, in Marcella Hassan still producing, Paul Prudhomme, Wolfgang Puck. All the people that he sort of discovered are still around and have wonderful contributions, to make wonderful contributions to the culinary field. And that's one thing. And secondly, Craig was a very proper Southern gentleman, and it was kind of hard to get close to him. But once you did, he let you love him. And he was in my life till the very, very end of his life. I think but 1 week before he died, he was in my restaurant, and every party I gave, he went there in his wheelchair, and he was there, and he supported me forever, like he supported so many of the people that he brought to the fore. So I'm so happy that finally he's being recognized, and I thank you so much for taking me into account and letting me tell my little Craig story, because I loved him very much, and I owe him so much.
Are there others who knew Craig Claiborne that would want to make a comment? Sure. Can we come up here? Microphone up here?
Oh, I don't need a microphone. I just
No, yeah, we do. We're being taped, and we really need it. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Natalie Dupree, and I knew Craig from the South. I met him when he came to my cooking school, but the thing that I wanted to add to contribute was that this is the New York perspective of Craig, and Craig's columns ran in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution every week, and the New York Times Sunday food section was as big a deal. We might not have gotten, you couldn't get the New York Times delivered during the week, but you could get the Sunday section. And so there was the power of the New York Times was extended not just in New York, which I realize is 3/4 of the world, but through, but it came to Atlanta, Georgia, through the newspaper Charleston, Charlotte. Those papers carried it, and that's not there anymore. You don't pick up an Atlanta paper and see the New York Times article very much. You know, it's an occasional, an editor decides to pick it up. And then Craig's column was replaced by Julia's, that weekly, it was, they took it from her book, I think. But I think that's just really important to say about the pervasiveness of his influence. And that influenced food writers all over, because they had to write their columns to be next to Craig Claiborne's. And you didn't say a word about how bad Craig was in restaurants. None of you. Molly, towards the end. But in fact, he did do some bad things in restaurants towards the end, but we all looked the other way because he was so kind. And because he did so many sweet things for us. He came to little tiny apartments when I had little parties, and was so gracious and loving, even though, you know, I was nobody. So I do appreciate Craig. I also know that he took a lot of recipes, and if you read his Southern Cooking book, you'll see a lot of that too. But he was a very generous, kind man to me. So.
Thank you very much. Anyone else want to make a comment? One more. Okay, back here. Can you give your name, please?
It's Susan Dresner. I met Craig once. I had formed the Four Seasons School of Cooking. I was extremely young at the time, and I was not a celebrity. And I think we need to go back, and I was very young when I was introduced to food, that Craig knew food. He cooked, he was trained in Europe, but he went to the little restaurants and to the little people, and he also wrote about them in addition to Côte Basque and Le Pavillon, and I don't see that too much these days. You know, the emphasis on the celebrity chef. Edna Lewis, you know, who was very influential, you know, he did 2 pages on Edna Lewis and made her, and getting back to Miss Martinez and so forth. And we owe a lot to food writing in terms of journalism and discovering that we're, you know, the integrity of cooking through Craig.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One more up here in the front. Your name?
Hi, my name is Clark Wolfe, and
That's gotta stand up.
all right,
Come on,
thank
Clark.
you. Hi there. I would like to correct one slight misconception. A wonderful panel. Craig did not like younger men. He liked older men. Until there weren't any older men. Craig was also gifted with something that cannot be explained except to say he had taste. He had brilliant taste, and he did, in the pages of the New York Times and over dinner, what Chuck Williams did in California. He adored women, especially socially, perhaps only socially. And he loved to entertain them, and he loved to learn style from them. He was a perfect guest until they got sloppy. And he learned every treat and every trick. He was always the host and the hostess. I was fortunate when I came to New York, and at the age of 29 with lots of black curly hair and Sally Jesse Raphael glasses. And this pretty much the same outfit, but anyway, to be invited to his 60th, was it? His 60th birthday party at Clamshell Lane, I think it was called. And there was Jacques Pepin roasting a kid over an open fire. And there was Alice Waters racing around with strawberries. And there was, Maida Heater balancing cakes. And that's not a euphemism for anything. And I was quiet uncharacteristically. And Alice came over, and anybody who knows Alice Waters, you don't really understand it until she touches you. She touches your face, and it's all about seduction. So Alice touched my face. She said, "Clark, you're so quiet." And I said, "Because I'm watching The Spectacle and The Ringleader." It was extraordinary. He was wonderful. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you. Final comment?
I have a question.
A question?
How many
Okay.
editions did the New York Times cookbook go through?
How many editions did the New York Times cookbook go through?
Well, I think, by the way, Molly was not correct that he never made a cent in royalties. I believe he did make royalties from this book because it was the one where he held the copyright through a mistake and oversight of the papers.
Right.
All
They
the
fixed it.
subsequent-
They fixed
All
it.
the subsequent ones were copyrighted by the New York Times. Well, this lasted in print for many, many years. I think probably 15 or 20 years. It was published in 61. In 1990, I believe, Harper and Row, or Harper Collins, whatever it was then, brought out the new New York Times cookbook, which contained a good deal of the same material. So that's as close to a second edition as it ever got. And that was in print for a few years, but never had as resounding a success as the original.
So how many printings?
How many?
I don't know how many printings. At the time the new New York Times cookbook was published, or no, it was at the time A Feast Made for Laughter was published, 1982. He said that the publisher claimed there had been sales of 3 million copies. However, I happened to see an article in Publishers Weekly a couple of weeks before that that said 750,000.
That's 3 million.
That's close.
Very substantial.
I would like to thank our panelists. I thought they were superb.